before I begin, I want to give a big thanks to the rest of the team there at PMI, Ken Hauser, Tom Wood. You guys are a huge help. And Jessica, of course, you do most of the work in all this, so appreciate you helping make this possible. And to all you attendees, as always, if you've got a topic that you're willing to present, then please get in touch with me and we'll get you scheduled, and we'll appreciate it. So today we're going to talk a little bit about why to share search and rescue stories, why not to share them, and then we'll spend most of our time teaching you how to share them with about a dozen of the best writing techniques that I taught in universities for about 15 years. So we'll use examples from my book, Search and Rescue, 75 Search and Rescue Stories, an insider's view of survival, death, and volunteer heroes who tip the balance when things fall apart. And if you'd like to get a lot greater detail on all these writing skills, then you can find them in The Art and Craft of Writing, the ultimate step-by-step guidebook to the writing process and effective composition, where I compiled my most important and useful lessons from my whole university teaching career. And now I think it seems appropriate to begin with a story, and for convenience, I'll tell you about the story with this picture that you see on your screen right now. And this is the time that some search and rescue members got together with some Utah Department of Transportation avalanche forecasters, and we rode the lift to the top of Sundance Resort up above Provo Canyon, and eventually triggered a deadly avalanche, or at least a potentially deadly avalanche. I'm not going to give away the whole story, the whole ending already, so you have to wait and see. And as we joined in, we climbed for quite a while, and we reached this really beautiful chute, kind of sheltered, where the wind had deposited a foot or two of powder, and it just looked like ultimate. It was steep. It was just beautiful. We wanted to ski it, but of course we needed to make sure that it was safe first, so we decided to do a cornice drop to make sure that the whole slope wouldn't break loose under our feet. So we chopped, there's about a 5-foot cornice conveniently there. We chopped it in half with a knotted rope, and it didn't slide off. Then one of the UDOT forecasters put on his harness and got tied off. He walked out there on his skis and jumped on it as hard as he could, but it just wouldn't budge. So we had to ditch our plans, and we decided to ski somewhere else. But of course, we didn't miss out on all the action. So let me ask you at this point, I'm going to pause the story and ask, how good of a story is this so far? It's pretty boring, right? Nothing's really happening. There's not much reason for you to care about it or get excited, except for, of course, the deadly, or, the potentially deadly avalanche coming up. But anyway, carrying on, we got skiing down the mountain somewhere in another direction, and we just tested each slope since the variable wind conditions in that area really made the snow conditions vary widely, when all of a sudden, teammate Bruce triggered a slab avalanche. He treated it like a ski cut, and he had the presence of mind to head for a group of saplings for an anchor. And so, just that one piece of snow broke, and we watched the avalanche tumble down the slope into the ravine, where Bill, one of the forecasters, stood on the far side. We looked at each other and we said, And then we kept on skiing down. We got back into inbounds in the resort. We got this photo in that avalanche report the next day, and that's basically the end. And I know what you're thinking now. You're like, what about the potentially deadly avalanche? Well, if you had lain down in the bottom of the ravine there and let all the debris pile over you, and nobody cared enough to dig you out, then you probably would have died. I know what else you're thinking too. You're thinking, that's a stupid story. And if that's what you're thinking, then I agree, you're right. But I intentionally chose this story so we can refer back to it, and I can teach you some of the ways that the story could have been turned into something worth writing, worth reading, worth hearing. But before we cover all those writing techniques, let's address the first question of this webinar, the question that we must answer before we even try to write, which is, why should we tell search and rescue stories? And the answer, of course, is that, it depends. The first thing it depends on is who you're going to tell your stories to. So if you want to share your stories with your team versus sharing them with the public, there are several excellent reasons to tell your stories. And the first one among them is for training purposes. We learn certain lessons better in hindsight. It's easier than learning them in the heat of the moment. Hindsight allows us to emphasize key points and draw out the ones we want to focus on. And it can teach really valuable lessons like those found on alpinenearmiss.org, for example, where you should, by the way, share your stories where of near misses, and read those ones submitted by others, because there's good information and maybe it'll help you avoid an accident in the future. We learn better from concrete stories that we can visualize and experience vicariously than from mere abstract ideas. So like if you're setting out on a rescue mission, maybe your team leader says, hey, watch out for snakes, guys. And that's a nice reminder. But how much better would you remember to watch out for snakes if he says something like, I once stepped on a rattler on this trail. Or I put my hand on a ledge while climbing in this area and it rattled at me. Now you've got a vivid, emotion-fueled image impressed in your mind to remind you every time you reach up into the dark. Stories supply experience quickly, broadly, and effectively, which helps pass your wisdom on to other team members in ways you can't really do it otherwise. And if nothing else, then stories are interesting and fun to hear. Here's what I wrote about it in chapter 1 of my 75 search and rescue stories. When I joined one of the world's best search and rescue teams a dozen years ago, I wanted to know everything about it, what to expect, how things worked, what to do and not to do, and what to think about the commitment I just signed up for. In short, I wanted to hear stories. Now I look into the eyes of this year's probies and I see the same hunger. They can hardly wait for the pager to go off. They want to get sent up the mountain or underground or into the river or onto the lake to help someone. They want experience, and there are only 2 ways to get it. Usually you have to learn the hard way. Trial and error, successes and failures. This sort of experience takes time and errors can prove costly. Experience is what you get, they say, when you don't have experience. A quicker and safer way to gain experience is to get it vicariously through stories. Stories provide concrete lessons that can be readily applied to real-world situations. They also have the benefit of hindsight to further draw out the important details. So eventually, after a dozen years on the team, I finally got around to writing my own book and sharing some of those stories, which I think most of our probies read. I mean, before they even join the team, a lot of them pick up that book to find out what our team's all about. Okay, if you want to share your stories with the public, then you've got different purposes, such as preventative search and rescue, stories and admonitions, but now people want to listen to them instead of feeling like they're being chided or something, and they'll learn better from stories than mere warnings, as I demonstrated with the example earlier. Recruitment is another great reason to share. How many of you applied to join SAR after seeing your local team on the news, or maybe heard stories from friends already on the team? I know that's how I got involved, and I bet that's how most of us did. A third reason, great reason, is fundraising. It should be obvious that people and companies would be a lot more willing to support us when they understand how much we do for them. Our team, my team, has received tens of thousands of dollars of generous support from several major corporations in recent years, and we even recently were able to purchase some very nice new team coats with those funds. Speaking of fundraising, by the way, maybe we should launch an MRA committee that gathers and publishes our best stories every year. And I think I can commit, if somebody will take over the webinar training committee for me, then I'll volunteer to be the editor and head up that thing. So if you're thinking about it, step right up. You got a great team to work for. Jessica does most of the work, so it's really not that hard. All right, there's also a general interest in information. People usually only have a faint idea of what we're all about, so it's nice to clear that up, that we're volunteers, that we don't charge for rescue, do we buy our own gear and probably pay our own gas on most teams. The public gathers most of their impressions from brief news reports, which, as you already know, are usually at least 10% incorrect. Either way, no matter who you're writing for, people simply love stories. Our brains are wired for narrative. We relate. We identify with the people in the story. We imagine ourselves there. We find meaning and vicarious experience that help us define our world. So you see, there are many reasons to share your rescue stories. Now, the next important question to ask is why we should not share SAR stories. And one of the main reasons we don't write more often, I assume, is that we're kind of a shy bunch, most of us. I think the public probably assumes that all we rescuers are brash, A-type, swashbuckling adventurers who swagger up the mountain to pluck all the weaker, lesser souls from the gaping jaws of death. And despite how much you may wish that was true, what I've mostly witnessed in all the teams I've met were that we're mostly helpers, really. We've got some valuable skills. We want to put them to use and make a difference. We chronically take ourselves for granted. We do the job and go home. We don't join SAR to be rock stars, and those who do usually don't last because the time and effort required isn't worth the small amount of attention we get from it. We are absolute heroes by every definition of the word, yet most of us feel uncomfortable accepting that title. Peer pressure may be a related factor, where teammates accuse you of showing off if you speak up and stand out, which isn't necessarily the case. And so what if it is? So what if you are? If that's what motivates you to do some good, then I say more power to you. Anyway, in short, shyness is not a good enough reason to withhold your stories. As Edmund Burke once said, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. So don't be a coward. Speak up and do even more good. It's a great opportunity. Ironically, the next reason we probably don't share our stories more often is because of risk. We're afraid of rejection and judgment because when you write something, it feels like part of you. It's personal, and that makes you vulnerable. If that's how you feel, you might as well just forget about it, right? Why are you even wasting your time on this webinar if someone might read your story and think you're dumb? Or, on the other hand, you could just get over it. You take bigger risks all the time, real risks in the line of duty, and you accept those risks because it's worth it, because it's a good cause. And I believe that sharing your stories is another worthwhile cause. You can always write them anonymously if you must. The next reason addresses the risk of what if something goes wrong during a rescue. Liability and litigation are legitimate concerns that should be addressed. Some stories and details shouldn't be made public. You'll have to decide which. You're not under oath to tell the whole truth, and you're not a journalist, if that even means anything anymore, since it seems like most journalists don't seem that concerned about telling the unbiased truth anymore anyway. Sensitivity to our victims is another valid concern. On our team, we have a social media policy not to share victim photos outside of our family and closest friends. We want to be respectful, and we don't want people to not call us when they need us because they're afraid of the attention they may get. Time can be another big concern, and writing can be time-consuming. Then again, so is SAR. So the real question, once again, is whether it's worthwhile. And later on, I'll show you some ways to save you a lot of time and speed up your writing to help reduce that barrier. Lastly, lack of confidence in your writing abilities may get in the way. Well, I think if you can tell a story, then you can write one, and especially with some help and some editing and some feedback. And this webinar will introduce you to several techniques to help you write it well and boost your confidence and enthusiasm to put your stories down on paper or onto a computer. In short, people want to hear your stories, so don't let these reasons stand in your way. And if you're getting tired, by the way, of someone on your team who just tells the same stories over and over again, you can encourage them to write it down. That way, next time they start up, you just say, yeah, I read this one already, and possibly save yourself from listening to it again. It's like telling someone, you should be on the radio when they're singing or something. Really, they ask? You think I'm that good? No, you explain, but then I could turn it off. All right, now for how to tell stories. And this part, by the way, isn't about writing techniques just yet. That's coming in a minute. If you want to write fast, then the most useful thing you can do is to not start writing until you first plan your writing. I've got a friend I used to teach with who spent at least 5 years writing a book because he couldn't figure out the ending. And once he'd come up with them, he had to go back through his story and change all these elements. And in the time he was working on that, I published at least 3 books in that same time period. Gathering your information and writing a detailed outline of what you're going to tell in your story is part of pre-writing, which is the first step of the writing process. This is one thing I used to stress all the time, trying to convince my students to use the writing process. It made their writing faster, better, and they'd actually learn something a lot more in the process. They were often somewhat lazy and reluctant to do anything that seemed like more work than absolutely necessary, which of course I'm sure they would have referred to as efficient. But they usually learned by at least halfway through the semester that following the writing process and planning ahead saves you from 90% of the headaches you run into if you don't. I expect better of all you, not only because you're smarter and more mature than they were, but because you know all about how crucial preparation is to execute a mission smoothly. When you get up on the mountain unprepared, You feel like an idiot, don't you? It's embarrassing. So don't let that happen in your writing. On the other hand, if you want to just launch into writing, that's fine. It's your call. But who knows? Maybe you're an adult prodigy. But if you get stuck, or when you get stuck, then go back to making your lists and brainstorming and outlining before you draft, which is the next step, draft, which means that's when you actually write your story. And keep in mind when you do this that it's only a first draft, and that will help to remind you that it's not yet a finished product, so you can stop worrying about perfection at this point and just lay some words down. Just get them out there, because in the next step you're going to work with them, you're going to perfect them. That's called revision. And revision, one of my students once defined this quite well. He says, revision is when you do what you should have done the first time but didn't. Writing something perfectly the first time around isn't usually possible. So in revision, you take any spots that are not yet good enough and you make them good enough. By the way, that's where the image came from on the cover of my writing textbook. There's a graphic inside that points that out. If you take any weak writing and you develop it further or revise or rewrite it, resize, reduce, remove parts, relocate it, and turn it into strong writing. And if you don't know which ones are the weak and which are the strong, just get other people to read it. Ask them, tell them, don't correct your spelling and your commas. You know, it's not editing. That comes way later. That's way ahead of the game. But just give you their reaction. You know, which parts did they find interesting? Where did they get confused? Where did they start to get bored? It doesn't matter if they know anything about writing, because you just want to observe a normal human reacting to the story, because that's who's going to be reading it later, not a bunch of college professors. Incubation was my students' favorite step, of course, and this is where you just set your writing aside for a day, a week, or a month, so you can come back to it with fresh eyes and new ideas. You'll find that what you thought was an excellent story can be significantly improved. And that's a good sign. That means you're even better now than you were before. I've been spending some really long hours in the last week, especially writing my next book. And finally yesterday afternoon, I just could not write anymore. I had to go for a walk around in the rain for an hour or so, just let the ideas fall into my brain more clearly. And that's also part of incubation. The very last step of the writing process is editing. So don't spend time editing, fixing your spelling and grammar until you get to this point, until the story is pretty much finished, unless it really bothers you, because that's like putting up the frame of a house and then painting it before you put on the drywall. You're going to change things around anyway, so don't worry about the little insignificant flaws. Most writer's block, by the way, occurs because you're doing the first and last jobs at the same time. You're editing and pre-writing. You're trying to generate content and you're judging it as if it's finished product. And that really gets in the way. So if you're judging your early drafts too harshly, then slow down. You know, judging it too much when you start writing reminds me of a driver one winter who I found stuck in the snow in her car. So I kind of pushed while she drove and it wasn't really working. So I asked if I could drive and hopped in and the car just pulled right out easy. And she hopped back in and the wheels just spun all over again, which I found a little bit puzzling until she mentioned that she's like, aren't you supposed to put it in second gear when you're on ice? And I was like, no, you're not. Slow down. So don't try and do everything at once. Don't be like a brand new SAR member eager to go and do something before you even are clear on where you're supposed to go and what you're going to do when you get there. Don't edit and judge your story until it's practically finished. Let me explain one more conceptual idea, or a set of ideas, before we jump into the writing skills. And every decision you make as a writer falls into one of these three categories. The first one is content. This comes down to picking the stories you want to tell and gathering the details for each story that you want to include. Next is organization. And there are many ways to organize writing, but since you're writing stories and not academic papers, this becomes a fairly straightforward decision, and your stories will mostly be told in chronological order. You can vary that with some flashbacks and flash forwards to make things more interesting. So in fact, let me show you how to do that briefly. So here's that story of our little ski potentially deadly avalanche I told you earlier, which, by the way, I recognize even after this, it's not enough information to make this a good story. That's coming up. So we met at 8 a.m., we rode the lift, we ducked under the ropes, we climbed, the whole cornice thing. And then right there in the middle, that part in orange, that is the crux of the story. That's the only interesting part of the story, even slightly interesting. And the way I separated it, I call that a time box. So when you have a story, I want you to identify which part of the story is the best part. Where's the action? And then I recommend that you start telling the story right there. And then if you need to flash back and, give some information, like the snow snapped. Oh my gosh, was Bruce going to die? And then flashback, we had climbed the mountain with the Utah forecasters. It was a beautiful day, etc. If you need to. When you do that, when you use flashbacks, one great thing that they do, well, two great things. First, it puts you right in the excitement and catches your interest right away. And then you are willing to read the background information to find out, because you want to find out what happens, because there's a problem and your brain wants to solve it. Also, it really speeds up the pace, because when you back up to tell the information, it's so much faster. You don't need as many words because people already know more or less who you are and what's going on. Here's an example of starting a story with the time box, with just enough information to set the scene before the most gripping moment. I stopped my Forerunner on the river trail above Canyon Glen Park and jumped out, pulling the last of my wetsuit on and zipping up my PFD. Tom's sheriff truck had stopped in front of me, and a dozen Provo and North Fork firefighters lined the trail in river's edge 15 feet below. "You ready?" Tom asked, quickly glancing over my gear. "Go," he directed, and I scrambled down the bank. My eyes swept over the scene as I took in what was going on. Kenny of North Fork made his way up the river's edge, dressed in his dry suit and gasping for breath. Firefighters lined the shore, some holding throw bags, none of them in water gear. Out in the middle of the river, pinned against the large rock, the pale legs of a 9-year-old girl showed through the clear water. This is what, I forgot to mention one more reason maybe not to tell your stories is, I don't know what kind of rescue you are, but for me, I get out there on the hill. I wrote a whole chapter about this in the book called Rescue Mode, and you do what needs to be done, and you try and do a great job and help people out, but I don't like to think about it too much. And there's one story where there was a drowning out in Utah Lake, and I went out. I was on a wave runner and a watercraft, and we got the raft and brought it back in. And when I was dropping it off on the beach to go out and do some more searching, I saw this boy's sister run up to her mom, and they talked for a second, and she just doubled over, just sobbing. And I tried to look away, but it was too late. And that still kind of bothers me, I wish I hadn't seen that. So in writing my book, that was actually one of the hardest things. It was a lot of downer stories in there. It was kind of unpleasant to remember those. But I think it was a good enough cause, so I don't regret it. But anyway, I happen to know the family of this story that's on the screen right now too, so don't necessarily like telling it either. Anyway, in this one, I probably could have started even more in the action right when I dove into the river and swam out toward the little girl, and that probably would have been better. Oh well, hindsight, there's no single right way to tell a story. If you don't want to start with the action, you can still tell it chronologically, but you can still generate some interest from the start by using foreshadowing. Maybe you've heard this called a hook, something to create curiosity, capture their attention, or set expectations, and give them a problem to solve. If there's something wrong, if there's someone missing or something, or someone hurt, our brains hate to have things wrong, and they want to solve it. And that's one great way to really engage people in the story. It creates tension, and you're going to want to maintain that tension throughout the story. So if you solve one problem, make sure you've already introduce something else to catch their attention, or a problem to solve. Hint at challenges or dangers ahead or whatever. A little foreshadowing is not enough to save this story, the avalanche one. But as I said, in a minute I'm going to show you what you could do that would rescue that story and make it better. By the way, did you notice what I just did? I just told you something to anticipate. Maybe not something terribly exciting, but I hope I captured your attention a little bit more, keep you a little more engaged. All right, back to organization. As far as the overall book outline goes, if you're writing a series of SAR stories like I did, then the order is not that important unless some stories build on other ones. In 75 Search and Rescue Stories, I included some stories initially from when I first joined the team, and after that I just made sure there weren't too many of the tragedies in a row, just to keep things kind of mixed up. You don't need a major plot, or theme to develop between all these standalone vignettes. The third and last of the concerns here to consider, which we don't have a lot of time to go into, by the way, is style. And that includes, for example, tone. What do you want to be? What do you want it to be like? Do you want to be objective, like a newspaper kind of factual report? Or do you want it to be drama or maybe some humor? So, and it can vary story to story, but just be aware of that. Be very careful, by the way, if you use humor. Make sure it comes across well, because humor is a lot like singing, where if you happen to hit a wrong note, everybody cringes. It just is off. It's bothersome. Sarcasm, it's rarely a good idea. It does not come across well in writing unless you really establish it well, and it may make you look like a jerk. As for perspective, just decide whether you're going to tell your stories in first or third person, and I'm just going to send you to Google to find out more about that if you need to. And at last, let's start learning some writing skills. I've got 3 screens coming up that will talk about different sets of writing skills to briefly explain, and we'll look at some examples to illustrate them. This may sound obvious, but it's important. Make sure you include enough details to let your readers visualize what's going on. Everything is obvious to you as you write because you were there. And so your brain fills in those details between your words, but your readers were not. So you need to give them some eye candy through your words so they can visualize it. When you describe the scene, write it as if you're a camera lens. This is talking about organizing your details. Maybe you start with this wide established shot, describing the sky and the mountains and the snow, and then you zoom in to a child stuck on a cliff. Or maybe you do the opposite, starting with a bead of sweat running down this rescuer's nose as he or she huffs a litter up the trail. Using action verbs makes all the difference. An action verb is anything that shows action, and the more specific, the better, because it makes the story, the image, that much more vivid and energized in the reader's mind. So don't say you went up the mountain. That's an action verb, technically, but it's also very general and vague and boring. Use instead that you hiked, or trudged, or ran, or staggered if you're really tired. Much more vivid, see? By the way, the only verbs that aren't action verbs are either helping verbs like have and do, and those are fine. Don't worry about those. And then be verbs. Maybe you've heard about those from your English teachers, which are not so fine. Not if you use too many of them, at least. And there's really only technically one be verb, the verb to be. But that verb, it's so vague. It's doing nothing. It has so little energy. It just sits there. It just is, that it can put your readers to sleep. So replace those whenever possible with strong action, good active verbs. I remember one paper I was grading years ago. It was well written, it was well organized, he had some illustrations, and I couldn't stay awake past the first page. So I shoved under 10 more papers, and I thought I'd try again later. Same thing, 3 times. On the 3rd time, I stopped to figure out what is going on. Why can't I stay awake? I mean, I had been, already graded about 8-inch stack of papers probably by that point. But I went through and I circled all the be verbs on that first page, and there were 27 of them. And that was why. So that's a kind of quick way to fix your writing and make it much better. But replacing be verbs is trickier than you think. A lot of times you'll take one out and all of a sudden you'll realize you just moved it over somewhere else. So I'm sure there's something online or in my textbook if you really want to figure out how to do that well. Okay, often when we describe a scene or action, we focus solely on what we see there, visual, right? So sensory details remind you that explaining all the senses makes the story come much more alive. Tell what you heard, how things felt, and what you smelled. Let me tell you 2 additional tips that are really, really helpful with sensory details. First, when you mention objects that automatically elicit a sensory response. So if I mention an icy breeze, your mind may generate a memory. You may generate one of those in your imagination and experience that. If someone's crampon stomps on the back of someone's hand and the sharp steel spikes poke all the way through and stick out the palm, you probably just had a visceral reaction to that, didn't you? You probably grimaced or something. That's what I'm talking about. That's how useful these things can be. Makes it very real. Secondly, that example also illustrated the best technique to enhance your sensory details, and that is to mention specific body parts when you mention them. So if there's a cold rain, that's great, but explain how it ran down your forehead and into the corner of your mouth where it tasted like salt. Or if you bumped your leg, then get more specific. You got a huge leg, right? So what part of your leg? Was it your shin, your knee, or what? That makes it much more vivid and specific. Next thing, something we often overlook when we're describing things, and especially stories where things happened, is to combine our physical description with abstract concepts. Concrete items are easier to describe and understand when you're just telling the story, then this happened, then that. But abstractions are the most interesting things on the planet, without a doubt. Combine the two for best effect, and they each complement the other. Now, I mentioned earlier that I was going to tell you something that could save that story of our little tiny avalanche that we happened to knock, 150 feet down the mountainside. And this is it. As just a standalone story, it's pretty boring, pretty uneventful. I mean, it'd be okay. Maybe somebody would be like, oh, I think that's really scary. But, or that's cool, you got to go to Bounds or something. But what if Bruce was moving to Florida for the rest of his life, and he would never see another mountain ever, never touch snow, and this was his last big hurrah. And he wanted it to be memorable. So he was savoring every moment, and then here's this avalanche, and it makes it memorable. See, that makes it much more interesting, and maybe that story then would be worth telling. Abstractions are great. So as you pre-write your stories, as you plan them, write, why was the story matter? Why was it interesting? Why was it scary? What emotions did you experience? And then weave those into the story, Probably don't dwell, all on abstract and then just story. Probably weave them back and forth together for best effect. Okay, finally, metaphors are the quickest way, one of the quickest ways to inject some energy and interest into your description. This happens because metaphors make your brain work to figure out exactly how to understand the comparison in there, and that makes your brain feel good. That's the same reason that humor works, by the way. Your brain processes a punchline, it reconsiders the whole joke that just happened, and your brain spins fast, and it feels so good that you laugh out loud. Metaphors work by comparing two dissimilar items with just the right amount of traits in common. Not too much, not too little. And I've got some examples here to read to you to illustrate this too much, too little, this mama bear, papa bear, and baby bear comparisons. So you identify which ones, if they have too much, too little in common, or what. So here's the first one. This is from a metaphor contest that I found online years ago. John and Sally had never met. They were like two hummingbirds who also had never met. By the way, technically I know that's a simile because it says they were like, not a metaphor, but it doesn't matter. We're just talking about this style of comparison. So obviously that's way too little in common. They had nothing in common except for the fact that, with hummingbirds, that nothing met. So the contest obviously was trying to write bad ones and going to these extremes, what made it bad. Here's another one. He stood as tall and straight as a young tree. He stood as tall and straight as a young tree. That's a pretty good one, right? It's fine. But compare it to this one next. He was as tall as a 6-foot 3-inch tree. Well, why even compare it to a tree if you're going to say 6'3"? Next, here's a favorite. Her eyes were like two brown circles with black dots in the center. Too much in common. Next, her hair glistened in the rain like nose hair after a sneeze. Okay, so maybe the glistening works, but that's really disgusting and slimy. So maybe that metaphor drew in some information you didn't mean to imply, unless this is a homeless person who has not washed her hair in months and it's just greasy and gross. One more. The breeze felt as refreshing as a 50-foot ocean wave. Actually, if you think about it, it's not really refreshing at all, is it? Probably breaking your rib cage and grinding sand into your eyeballs. So better to compare that refreshing breeze to an early morning dip in the lake or something. That one's more like a mistake you're more likely to make in your own writing. All right, check out this comparison and look for examples of the techniques we just discussed. And notice in this one, the descriptive details and the visual order that things get described in, that camera angle thing. Chapter 4 here, welcome to Utah County. Utah County's varied and extreme topography makes it a perfect location for search and rescue, if you like excitement and challenge, that is. Scattered across 2,000 square miles stretches the southern terminus of the Wasatch Range. 11,000 foot Mount Timpanogos and almost 11,000 foot Cascade Peak sometimes seem built half of rock and the other half stone. Cliffs pile one atop another as mountains shed altitude in their own version of a crash diet. Crystal streams tumble down gullies and ravines, while pine and aspen grow in terraced layers like a Boy Scout's dream birthday cake. At 4,400 feet above sea level, the lowest point of the valley floor towers above state high points of 25 other states. Stack another 7,500 feet atop that for the county's high point, Mount Nebo's nearly 12,000 foot cone, and only a dozen states stand taller, including Utah's 13,500 foot Kings Peak. Yet Utah County doesn't only go up. Beneath the surface, caves plunge deep into the Earth's crust. The West Desert has Utah's 9th deepest known cave, and it continues on from there, but it kind of guides your eyes this way and in that way. So there's one way to organize your information. Okay, in this one, notice more details, a metaphor, and some weak sensory details and abstractions toward the end that could be improved on. This is from the same story. This is the end of that same chapter. 500,000 county residents can't avoid catching a glimpse of nature's majesty every time they step outside. Steep mountain ridges catch the morning sun and make them feel like they live in a postcard every time they look up. Canyon breezes tempt commuters to skip work and go for a hike. Afternoon sunlight shimmers like a million diamonds on the lake and calls students from 2 major universities to take time out for the dip in the lake's murky but refreshing ripples and waves. Some resist Mother Nature's temptations, others yield. Eventually, inevitably, something goes wrong. People get lost, stranded, hurt, or killed. Entropy is a law of nature. It's the one predicting that things fall apart. Spend enough time in nature and it happens to everyone, regardless of whether they have prepared or not. That's why we're here. Search and rescue volunteers are on call 24/7, 365 to pick up the pieces and, as much as possible, glue them together again. So you see that's some details. It had the lake shimmering like diamonds. It had some abstractions talking about entropy, and that's why SAR, is there. So anyway, another example. This one starts out with a metaphor comparing Utah Lake to the deadly monster, and we're not going to read it. You can watch the video and pause it if you'd like to see how I transitioned from that introduction to a story about one of the lake victims. In fact, this is the story about the boy who drowned, the sister who I wish I didn't see, doubling over and sobbing. My favorite thing about this story is the sensory details. So see if you can pick them out as I read through. When we turned to exit the marina, I adjusted the wording a little bit so it doesn't work here. Immediately countered the large waves. With any speed at all, our watercraft launched from wave crest to wave face, a jarring experience that made me wonder how long the hulls could stand it before smashing to pieces. We adjusted our speed up and down for a minute, seeking the ideal speed to cross the wave intervals more smoothly, but only slowing down to a few miles per hour could reduce the pounding. I turned toward Olin and pointed west. He nodded. The plan was to cross the lake nearly perpendicular to the waves rather than trying to drive directly toward our destination 5 miles away. I squeezed the throttle and felt the satisfying power of the 1.8-liter engine thrust the craft forward. By changing our trajectory, we were able to travel around 60 miles per hour. We still spent roughly half the time airborne, but we landed smoothly in the next trough rather than slamming hard against each wave face. The speed felt good, as did the jumping, the smooth landings as the wedged hole sliced apart the water surface, and the combination of sun, wind, and occasional spray of water on my face. Having a destination and an important purpose made it all the more rewarding. No wonder everybody on the team likes lake rescues. So there you see a few skills, and a few skills we haven't even mentioned yet. On the last paragraph, the occasional spray of water on my face. Was that a sensory one for you? Did you kind of imagine what that feels like? If so, that's great, but I could have taken my own advice and made that more specific, because face is kind of general. So if it would have been on my cheek or, in my eyes or, something like that, that would have been even more effective than it was. Okay, here we're back to the river rescue we began earlier. Notice which parts of this description affect you as you listen to it. Kimmy lay there, submerged and face down, her legs only a few inches below the clear, glassy surface. I grabbed her legs and held on tight, determined not to let her wash away from my grip, and expecting to find her wedged in tightly based on Kenny's experience of having difficulty dislodging her. Instead, she slipped right out. I lifted her limp body into my arms and cradled her against my chest. She smelt small and light. She was not breathing. I didn't take time to check for a pulse, as there was nothing I could do about it, perched precariously midstream. I spun my legs sideways, and the current swept us back into the river. My feet touched bottom, and I took several steps through the boulder's eddy, then swam when the current knocked me down. I kicked hard toward shore, holding the child up in front of me, then shouted, "Take her!" to a fireman waiting with the throw bag as I swept past. He lifted her from my arms, and I washed another 50 feet downstream before I could stop and climb onto the bank. Okay, next, this one has a metaphor and sensory details as it describes racers in an Ironman. Hordes of Uber athletes plunged into the water, reaching out with muscular arms and pulling against the lake, then raised their arms above the water, fingers sliding up their lats and past bulging shoulders sporting a number written with permanent marker, and reaching ahead once more to punch the water, break the surface tension, and open a passage for head, shoulders, and body to slip through. Legs kicked hard, bodies rolling elegantly back and forth from side to side as they charged fluidly forward. Left, right, left, right, left, right. Mouths blew bubbles underwater, releasing spent air whose oxygen had been sucked out by muscle cells now burning fuel like coal heaped into a locomotive's furnace. Now and then a racer twisted his or her neck to one side or the other to gulp down a fresh lungful of air. The swimmer's lips resembled the blowholes of an enormous pod of very slow dolphins. So that had a bunch of those, lots of details, sensory details, metaphor written in there. And I hope that made it feel a little bit like you were there. I like that part, opening a passage for the head, shoulders, and body to slip through. Now, and here's one I didn't mention. That word slip, that's the S and L, kind of soft slip, that it feels like slip. So that's another great way to make your sensory details work really well. It's probably the third best way to make sensory details work great. I've got like 7 of them in my textbook. Is use words that sound like the feeling. So that's another one. And last one, another metaphor with a bunch of details. I knew the Ariane had climbed here before. This is my first rescue, by the way, ever. 16 years ago, in like 2 weeks from now. Stairway to Heaven is a 800-foot frozen waterfall, the tallest free-flowing vertical ice in the lower 48. Standing in the center of the 200-foot wide ice sheet gives the impression that time has stopped a frothy waterfall. You might glance around half expecting to see a salmon caught mid-leap up the falls, or a grizzly bear standing half submerged, stretching out its toothy snout to catch the fish for dinner. The ice came and went, waxing and waning throughout the winter, depending on the air temperature. Cold temps turned the ice thick but brittle. Warm spells gnawed away at the ice and sometimes sent huge columns crashing down the mountainside. All right, so there's your examples. Next writing skill set are about characterization. Characterization is essential telling search and rescue stories, because if readers can't relate to the people in your stories, if they don't get inside their heads and experience them as actual human beings, then it's just another Hollywood action movie where everything blows up and the heroes live happily ever after, or die, and nobody really cares. One of the fastest, easiest ways to characterize someone is to tell their age. Age suggests so much about someone's mindset, maturity, fitness level, etc. And the way people dress is also extremely helpful. Like, was the hiker wearing flip-flops, or did they have top-of-the-line Arc'teryx jacket and 15 pounds of black diamond gear strapped around their waist? So those are quick ways to make sure you add those in. Describe how someone moves Also, their mannerisms. What kind of stride do they have? Are they confident and bold or hesitant? Showing what people are thinking and feeling by describing their actions is way more interesting and convincing than merely telling us that he was mad or sad, bold or afraid, strong or weak. And these clues bring your characters to life in readers' minds. Even better than describing actions is showing their reactions. When something happens, what clues to someone's feelings can you read in their body language or facial expression, for example? Did they grimace? Did they laugh? Did their eyes widen? Okay. What about their words? Of course, you don't have to only show everything. You can also talk about ideas. You can add those abstract ideas. This is worth mentioning here again because it blends very well with these other skills to provide more clues about what the people are experiencing. Is the weather getting worse? Are they afraid of the dark? Do they wish they had never brought this stupid, gadget or whatever, GPS, with them to get them into all this trouble? And then now, last but not least, are words. Dialogue is actually the single most powerful way that you can characterize a person in your stories. You can describe someone for paragraphs, and you can but if you just let us hear them speak, then readers will judge for themselves. So do not, when using dialogue though, use it to characterize. Don't waste it on anything that does not characterize a person or move the plot along. When you quote somebody, use realistic words. Let us hear the way they really speak. So if a teenager, for example, is going to go to the store, they don't say, "I am going to go to the store." They say, I'm going to Macy's, or whatever. So use realistic words and brainstorm. This is part of pre-writing. Brainstorm the way people really said things and the way it describes. If somebody's a cowboy, spell their words with the Western slur. Okay, really make it realistic. Very important. Very useful. You can let us hear their thoughts also, and you can treat that like dialogue if you want. If they're just thinking things, you can put it in quotes. But if they're thinking things and saying things out loud, then it gets confusing if it's all in quotes. So put their thoughts in italics, and that helps separate that. And to make the most of dialogue, make sure and combine it with all the other descriptive tools like the actions and reactions and stuff like I mentioned earlier on this page, so people can interpret their feelings. Okay, include their thoughts. Let's just look at a couple examples. This story of my very first rescue shows some concise language, just like the real-life situation, and some thoughts to accompany the words. An ICS member walked by and checked my gear. Avalanche beacon, probe and shovel? I nodded and spun to show the shovel strapped to my pack. Okay, you're on team 3. What's your number? 750, I answered, trying to conceal my eagerness to get hiking. He wrote it down and turned to evaluate another party. The trail up to the ice is steep and covered in frozen dirt and boulders of various sizes. Team 3 hiked quickly for 100 yards, then paused to catch our breath. I moved to the top of the group before stopping. We caught up with Team 2 at the second lowering station, being tied to stubby trees and boulders, and I again moved to the top of the group before stopping. Team 2, Team 1, a dozen radios squawked. Go for Team 2, the team leader replied. We could use 4 more people up here, and does anyone have extra blankets? I have blankets, I reported quickly, still trying not to show how badly I wanted to get sent up. I feared that overeagerness would diminish my credibility. Better to appear level-headed and calm. Go, the team leader said, pointing to me, then designating 3 others. So I hope you can tell how the dialogue made it seem more real, and the short little sentences maybe added kind of a sense of urgency, and then combining the abstractions like how I was trying to look calm and how I really wanted to do something on my first call. You remember what that was like when you were new. So, okay, this one is from my second ever team meeting where us newbies were invited to introduce ourselves. I'm just going to skip down to the bottom half of this, actually. 2 other probies introduced themselves, and then came my turn. As I stood and opened my mouth to tell my name, my cell phone rang in my pocket. My ringtone was the tune from Indiana Jones. Da 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 da. CJ, who was the president, and he was running the meeting, cocked his head slightly, and his jaw dropped enviously. I want my own theme music, he exclaimed. So that begins to kind of characterize CJ, right? And show the team of the team meeting. He's funny, he's clever, etc. All right, as chapter 18 begins, notice the effect of describing our reactions, people's reactions here. What's the toughest call you've ever been on? A probie asked Olin. Olin thought for a minute, then began his answer. There was a couple in their 70s, he began, and several of us rolled our eyes and nodded our heads, recalling the incident and reliving the memory of our suffering that night. So just by describing, rolling our eyes and nodding our heads and then the abstraction, reliving the memory of suffering, you kind of puts you in our spot, kind of characterizes, right? Okay, last one. See how the words create an impression of these hunters. As the dogs, by the way, these guys capsized their boat in, a couple miles from shore in Utah Lake. This one was either November or December. We had 2 in a row that were similar one year. As the dogs continued to scamper back and forth across the hole, which is upside down, they threatened to tip it and send Percy back into the water. And Percy's like a young teenage kid. We got to shoot him, Gary declared. We ain't going to shoot Percy, Gerald objected. Are you out of your frickin' mind? Not Percy, you idiot. We got to shoot the dogs, Gary bellowed back. If they keep running around like that, they're going to knock Percy off. What's the matter with you? Oh, Gerald muttered. The cold was really digging into his skin now, along with the seriousness of their predicament. No one would know they capsized the boat. No one would expect them back for hours. What's the point, he thought to himself. We're all going to die out here anyway. Give me the gun, Gary directed. Gerald was cradling his new Remington 20 gauge when the boat flipped, and he had somehow managed to hang on. He would miss the dogs, but they could be replaced. He handed the shotgun to Gary. When he felt Gary grab the double barrel underwater, he let go. Give me the gun, Gerald, Gary commanded again. No use putting it off. It's got to be done. I already gave it to you, Gerald said. You mean after you poked me with it? Boyd asked. I never poked you with it, Gerald objected, and it dawned on everyone at the same time what happened. Gerald thought Gary had the gun and simply dropped it into the lake. Gary sighed. So that's got all of it. That's got the dialogue. It's got some thoughts there in italics. It's got actions and reactions, some description, and there you go. By the way, I explained early in the book, in the beginning, I don't know all these details from before the rescue happened, but I filled in with what I know, and then I make up the rest so you can identify with people. It doesn't really matter that this is not exact because these situations happen over and over with different people again and again, but I wanted it to seem like a real situation for people in the book to feel the importance, the urgency here before we get on with it. Okay, here's the final set of writing skills, contrast and rhythm. These seem fairly subtle, but they're incredibly powerful in the way they set the pace, generate tension, and draw reader focus to the important elements in the story. So see how this, for example, this photo of hiking into the clouds is kind of washed out. Nothing really stands out. It's all kind of flat. You don't want your writing to come out like that. Instead, you want it to be sharp and crisp. And on this one, you can't help focusing on specific things, right? There's the climber, the rope, the cliff and the icicles, and then next you notice the snowflakes and the cliffs in the distance. It really draws your eyes to specific things, and that's how you want to tell your story. One way to accomplish this is to simply describe contrasting things with your content. So if you've got one character who's very intense, maybe you also describe someone else who's more laid back. When you have contrasting characters like that, that's called a foil, by the way, in theater and everything. And it helps emphasize both of them because you can see what one is kind of by seeing what the other one, what they're not also. So if you get out of your truck into a freezing blizzard, then before you open that door, first describe how cozy and warm the heater felt on the inside of the truck. You can also contrast the pace when a story goes from bad to worse, or the sense of relief when things go right, and there are other ways to adjust to contrast pace as well. And intention, we've talked about this a couple times, and by this I mean dramatic tension. And this simply means that readers want to keep reading to find out what happens. One technique to accomplish that, as I mentioned earlier, is to present a problem that readers want to see resolved. How does it get fixed? They're glued until it does. You can also foreshadow events for them to watch for later, and of course, if you make them care about the characters, that helps them get more interested in the outcome of the story also. The sounds you create with your words have a really surprising effect on how your story reads. It's really seriously like adding background music. It is very powerful. This is one of the easiest ways to make your writing sound great. And people will read it and they'll say, wow, you're a great writer. And they won't really understand why they feel so engaged by your words. You'll be like, really? What makes it good? They're like, I don't know, man. It's just good. The basic idea is that short words and short, hard sounds like plosives, like K, T, and K, T, D, P, D, like that, and short sentences, these create tension. While the longer sentences and words with softer sounds like and and sh, fricatives and glides and all that you can hold and sustain their sound, that makes it more soft and relaxing. So use those appropriately and then contrast them as well. If you want to have some tension in a specific spot, like look at the crux of your story, and right there, make sure you better have a short sentence or two or three with some words with hard sounds in there. Really makes a difference. Most beginning writers get comfortable with one certain length of a sentence, and then they repeat it endlessly. This makes your writing sound monotonous, and you miss a great opportunity to quickly make it better. So if you're doing that, just take some of those sentences, chop one in half to make some shorter ones, combine some others together to make some longer ones, so you have variety, sentence variety, it's called. You can quickly create some really neat rhythm by repeating words, which emphasizes them each time you repeat it. When you do, make sure you repeat it at least 3 times. Then it becomes a pattern, and it sounds like on purpose. If you just repeat a word twice, it sounds like it was an accident. And people are like, oh, you're a dumb writer. You repeated a word twice. Alliteration means starting out the word with the same sound, and it's like a backwards rhyme. Rhyme ends with the same sound. And this can be pleasing if you don't overdo it. Here's a sentence from my textbook to illustrate. A little alliteration is a lot like a lollipop, but soon the sweetness gets so supersaturated that somebody's senses will get overstimulated and stop savoring the experience. You do it too much, it's like Tammy Faye Baker's makeup, if you remember who she was. Just thick and just overdone, and it's not attractive. So use it sparingly, but definitely use a little bit. Parallel constructs is kind of the same thing as repeating. It's just you're repeating grammatical patterns, just like repeating words or sounds. So let's take a look at a couple of these in action, and you'll see what a difference they make. Here's a story about an incident during the 2002 Olympics. Watch for the varying sentence lengths as well as repetition of words and grammar patterns. SAR teams across the Wasatch Front and back trained together to work out interagency communication and logistical kinks before the real thing arrived and caught us off guard. Finally, the Olympics arrived. Massive fireworks displays lit up the valleys and illuminated the snow-covered mountains. Visitors landed at the Salt Lake International Airport and filled hotels and Olympic venues for the next 17 days. We woke up, went to work, came home, kept our pages near, and waited. And waited, and waited. The calls never materialized. The Olympic spectators turned out to be just that. They didn't come to Utah to ski or hike or climb, but to watch. Okay, here, notice how the slightly shorter sentences in the second paragraph and some of the short, hard words sounds increase the tension slightly. I went hiking above the falls myself one day to better familiarize myself with the terrain when I heard a loud whap above me. Looking 150 feet up the slope where no one had been hiking, I saw the top of a blonde head, its parts still perfectly combed, laying motionless in the dirt. "Hey," I shouted, "are you okay?" The boy did not answer or move. This one uses sentence length and word sounds to create some rhythms for background music. Life is hard. It's hard for everyone at times, regardless of the brave, happy face they may wear for the world to see. People often suffer alone, bearing their burden in silence when they should reach out for support. Eventually, the struggle wears them thin or crushes them completely. I don't know if any such feelings drove a young Utah County man to give up the fight one October night. All I know is that he wrote a note and left it with his watch and wallet along the river trail near the lake, shot up heroin, and stepped into the current. So, for example, I don't know what stood out for you, but like with his watch and wallet, there are 3 W's in a row. Not too much, but just kind of adds a little bit of rhythm there. Okay, that's it actually for all our writing tips we have time for today. But I want to leave you with really quickly a quick tip about what to do with your stories once you get them written. Once upon a time, the only honorable way to get published was to sign a contract with the official established publishing house. And so what you do is you go to the store, you find some publisher that publishes something similar to what you want to write, so you know they're kind of interested in that genre, and then you pick up Writer's Market, and that's how you find out how to contact the publishing house. You could also pay a vanity press to publish your book, but that was considered faking it and tasted a little dishonest. So times now, though, they is a-changing, and self-publishing is a perfectly legit and well-accepted way to get your words out there. And there are 2 web pages that you'll want to use for this. One of them is kdp.amazon.com. This is how you publish on Kindle. This is for ebooks, and that's by far where I sell my most books. It's popular, and it puts you in front of probably the biggest book market on the planet. And then there's also createspace.com, which is Amazon's paperback publishing wing. They've got the best prices, the best revenue stream there, whatever. And they make publishing really easy. When somebody buys your book on Amazon, which is probably the best market, they print and fulfill the order, then send you a check the next month. Then again, maybe somebody will volunteer to take over the webinar training committee, and we really will publish something for the MRA. So stay tuned. And if you do, by the way, I think I already said this, but PMI people, Jessica, Ken, Tom, great to work with. Just do it, because I kind of want to do this other project. I think it sounds exciting. In conclusion, please tell your stories. At least that's my opinion. I'd like to hear them, for one. I'm sure many other people would as well. Not everybody can participate in search and rescue. It is an incredible world we inhabit, and it's worth sharing. By spreading the word about what we volunteers accomplish, I think we'll make the world a better place. And you, as a search and rescue member, you have such a wealth of experience. It would be a shame for you to die and take all that with you without sharing it. So, and by the way, you can find these books and other ones at this jump link, j.mp/ShaunBooks. Order 20 of them for all your nieces and nephews. And that's it. So, Jessica, I'll turn it back to you for Q&A.
All right. Thanks, Shaun. And we'll go ahead and take some questions now. So there isn't any yet, but if you have questions for Shaun, please go ahead and type them into the chat/question section of your control panel, and we can answer them right now. So while everyone is typing, I'm going to switch the screen back over to mine. We do have a question. So Shaun, how has your team responded to your books being out there?
Great question, and the answer is mixed. Overall, very positive. In the several years since I put it out there, like I said, a lot of the new guys, when they apply to the team, they'll pick up the book. I remember, and sometimes they're local, they're close to the post office, so I'll just run and drop it off, and then I get to chat with them, and that's a lot of fun. And they appreciate, understanding so much more about how things work and how the team works and what's okay to do and what's not from it. So overall, very positive. I think a few people had some of those reactions that I kind of described about, thinking that it's wrong to put yourself out there and be seen at all. Not a big deal. And there was at least one person I think was a little bit jealous, but I'm like, I would love to actually, if I was going to create another one of these books, I would gather stories from the whole team, like this idea for the MRA, and put them together. But I just didn't have time. I had a 3-month little window where I had to really focus on this and write it. So I'm like, I just got to tell my stories because I don't have time for the rest. But overall, very positive. I think it's helped a lot. I think the community, they love it. The people I've talked to, just knowing what goes on, and they're like, wow, search and rescue, we had no idea. So it's overall been received extremely well. 4 or 5 stars on Amazon. Yeah.
All right, the next question is, should you release mission stories to the local media?
Okay, another great question, an important one. This is something that should probably be like codified in your organization. For example, during a rescue mission, unless ICS, unless the sheriff office, gives us the go-ahead, we're not talking to the media. We're not sharing those details, right? After a mission's over, then you can figure out the details of exactly how you want to manage that stuff. And actually, our sheriff office guys who we've got right now, they're awesome, and they just have such confidence in our judgment in general. I mean, every once in a while we'll do a misstep and we'll have a little chat about it, but that they're like, if you have something you want to share, go ahead. The media absolutely loves it. It's great for the public. It's great for your team's visibility, which helps with your fundraising and recruiting and your PSAR activities. I think it's a very good thing. Just be careful, be sensitive, with pictures of victims and things like that. But I would definitely recommend it. Also, by the way, don't let taking pictures interfere with your job up on the mountain. I mean, you've got people to help, and you've got everyone to keep safe. And there was a recent incident in Utah where something happened, and some people were filming it, and one of my teammates really isn't happy with that. Like, if they weren't holding their camera up, they could have stopped that little near miss from happening. So don't let it get in the way.
Okay, great. And those are the only questions we have right now. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. If you do have other questions, you can get them in quickly, and we can still answer them while I'm wrapping this up. So if you have any further questions that you think of later, or you're watching this webinar from the website, you can email Shaun your questions at the email shown on the screen. The MRA webinar series hosts webinars frequently, so keep an eye on the MRA and PMI websites for future dates and topics. Those links are also where you're going to go to find the recording of this webinar, as well as the webinar slides. And for news and updates, you can follow the MRA and PMI on Facebook and Twitter. You can find those links there as well. And that is just general updates as well as future webinars. So we appreciate you listening to this webinar. We hope that it was helpful for you. And Shaun, thanks for presenting it.
You're welcome. Thanks, Jessica, and thanks everyone for attending.
Great. Have a great day, everybody.